On this show, we talk a lot about China. And of course, there's been a flurry of diplomatic activity led by China, one of which hasn't gotten too much attention, which is that China's foreign ministry has called on Israel and Palestine to negotiate for peace. And now we have a call with Zelensky and Xi Jinping calling Vladimir Zelensky. This is a couple months after the peace proposal that China submitted, and has been calling on all sides to begin negotiating for peace. But in this call, he said that he would be sending a special envoy to Ukraine and related countries, he said, traveling to related countries. It'll be interesting to see which those are, to begin the process of a negotiated settlement. What do you have to make about this? Maybe we can start with you, Ali, on these developments and what they mean.
Yeah, well, just to say it's great to be back on the show, and great to be with you, Lowkey. It's just amazing. The work you do is incredible, and not just at Mint Press News, but we've been very happy to publish some of your work at the Electronic Intifada. So I feel like we're almost family here in this discussion, all of us. It's interesting that China has now assumed, in a real sense, the role that the United States always claimed to have but didn't, which is sort of the role of global leadership, the role of bringing people together to find diplomatic solutions. And it's, I think, particularly significant in the Middle East or Southwest Asia, because the US has for decades monopolized the so-called peace process. So even for China to suggest that it be a mediator between the Israelis and Palestinians is something that would have been laughed at a few years ago. And I don't think anything immediate is going to come of that. But the call now from China is one that I think can't simply be dismissed. China is now a credible mediator, and we saw that in a very real sense, because just a few weeks ago China mediated the historic reconciliation or rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which I'm sure we'll say more about later. But just in regards to the phone call between President Xi and Zelensky, that's something that people in the West have been demanding of China for a while, in the hope that somehow Zelensky is going to be able to convince China to change its policies towards the Ukraine-Russia conflict. I think that is, of course, not going to happen. But I think China is probably the only country that could play a credible mediating role because of its relationship with Russia and its just growing power and confidence. And it's clear that the United States only wants this war to escalate and to continue at the horrifying human cost that it continues to take. So I think it's a good thing. Talk is what's needed right now to end this war. And I think China's the only power that credibly brings some weight to the table in that sense.
I'm happy to jump in here if it's not untoward. Well, absolutely, Ali, thank you so much for everything that you have done with Electronic Intifada. It has been such an important vehicle through which we have been able to directly confront unaccountable powers for so many years. And at times when small glimmers of hope that we've seen in the mainstream have dropped the ball, whether it was with the lobby, the US edition, Electronic Intifada has come in and picked up that role and done so fantastically, and also been able to sustain its presence over these years, which is the biggest victory of all, especially in the shadow of this horrific most McCarthyite period since the period of McCarthyism, for sure. In terms of this question of China's involvement with the Palestinian issue and with the issue of Zionism imposing itself on people in the region, I would say there's an interesting comparison to look at. When we look at the 28 countries which are currently sending weapons and equipment to Ukraine, almost all of those countries designate, or at least are attached to, a body which designates the Palestinian resistance factions as terrorists. So, for instance, the European Union, which supposedly represents the will of 446 million people, obviously designates the democratically elected government in Gaza as a terrorist organization. And overall, the governments that make that designation, we can say, represent about 861 million people. Now, the governments that represent those people are actively involved in the war in Ukraine. But then when we look at the other governments that don't make that designation, we're of course talking about even Switzerland, which is 8.5 million people. We're talking about Pakistan, which is over 200 million people. But most importantly, China, which is 1.4 billion people, does not make that designation. And also importantly, China and Chinese people have a way of relating to the Palestinian cause, seeing themselves as post-colonial subjects that have gone through the 3 opium wars, that have been ravaged by British colonialism, that to this day are subject to interference from the United States and others. There are relations with Israel, that is a fact, but also there is an understanding of the Palestinian cause, and even in the last few years, particularly, signs of a closening of relations between Palestinian resistance factions and the Chinese government. But also, in addition to that, the very interesting thing I would say about the role China has been playing in mending fences between Iran and others in the region is that the Chinese, at the same time as investing 400 billion in the Iranian economy, and let's be clear, the Palestinian resistance factions, while Ukraine is armed by 28 different nations at minimum, the only state actor which actively materially supports the Palestinian right to armed resistance, which is clear in several UN resolutions and in anybody that has an ounce of humanity, is Iran. Now, what China has been able to do is say to Saudi Arabia, if you want us to trade with you in currencies other than the dollar, if you want the benefit of a good relationship with us, then you have to drop the sectarian agenda in the region and be willing to engage with Iran as a good faith actor. Now, that has led to a very interesting situation where the resistance factions in the region, and it's even been reflected in the way they're behaving, their ability to intervene most recently against what was happening in Al-Aqsa, and the way that they are speaking. There is a newfound confidence in the discourse that we are seeing the main resistance factions in Palestine and Lebanon speak with. And that is because they understand that when Iran is taken out of isolation, so too are the resistance factions. And so then instantly what that does is weaken Israel's ability to assert power over the Palestinians. And also, of course, we remember the Unity Intifada of 2021. It certainly wasn't the United States active at the United Nations to try and stop the bloodshed. It was the Chinese. And of course, the Israelis will be keenly aware of that. And so this shift in global power is definitely going to affect the balance of forces in Palestine and Lebanon for sure.
Yeah, and maybe Ali, you can jump in because you also wrote this really great article. I'll actually pull this one up as you're speaking about why the Saudis are calling off their Israeli marriage, and you bring up so many great points. One of which Lowkey was kind of referring to, which is as the U.S. declines, so too does Israel. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that in the context of there has been an escalation of violence in Palestine and occupied Palestine. Lowkey brought up the Al-Aqsa violence. There was also a raid on a refugee camp by Israeli forces, killing one, I believe it was a young Palestinian person. Could you tell me how this has happened? Because there seems to be a divergence now. Saudi Arabia does not feel like it has to appease the United States via normalization of Israel. In the article, you say that actually, and back in March, Biden was trying to get normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel cemented, and it just didn't happen. So what's going on here, and what's the larger context? Because it seems like, yeah, this multipolar moment is a big reason why this is occurring.
Absolutely. Danny, you've been so good on your show about really explaining and talking about the shift to a more multipolar world. And that's something that I think is clearly happening. And we're seeing it reflected in a very real way in the region, in the political dynamics of the region, and particularly around Palestine, as Lowkey said. And just before getting to the point that you raised, Danny, just a few days ago, the Israeli defense minister, or war minister more accurately, Yoav Gallant, made a statement where he said that Israel will face no more small wars. In other words, for the last however many years, Israel has been confident that it could, for example, attack Gaza and bombard Gaza to its heart's desire, and nobody will dare to lift a finger against it, or that it could go against Lebanon as it did in 2006, and nobody will lift a finger, or that it can attack Al-Aqsa and attack Palestinians in Jerusalem, and no one will lift a finger. What we saw shift decisively in May 2021, when Israel attacked Al-Aqsa back then, was that the resistance factions in Gaza entered the fray in defense of Jerusalem, in defense of Palestinians in Jerusalem. That was a first. We'd never seen that before. Then what happened recently at the beginning of Ramadan, just a few weeks ago, when Israel, again, we saw these brutal images of Israeli thugs beating worshippers inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, images that caused shock far beyond, far around the world in a way I've never seen before. This time there were rockets from Lebanon, a significant volley of rockets from Lebanon. Nobody claimed responsibility. Israel blamed Hamas primarily, I think, because they didn't dare to blame Hezbollah. Because if they had blamed Hezbollah, they would have been obligated in their minds to retaliate against Hezbollah, and that could have opened the gates of hell for Israel, as they would see it. So what that means is that Israel now cannot make a move on one front without risking a multi-front war. So that means, in a sense, the end of divide and rule. Because what has allowed Israel to exercise so much power is a successful divide and rule, where it had Palestinians isolated in Gaza and a few more isolated in the West Bank, and then Palestinian citizens isolated from everyone else, and Hezbollah isolated from the Palestinians, and so on, and Iran isolated from the region, which, as Lowkey pointed out, is the only country that supports the legitimate Palestinian right to armed resistance with real support. So that's how we see it within the region. Now, if we shift out to the broader picture, just cast your mind back a few years ago to Donald Trump and Jared Kushner and these grotesque and vulgar displays of normalization between Israel and various Gulf dictatorships, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and also Morocco and Sudan, with Israel under the rubric of the so-called Abraham Accords. And there was this euphoric moment where they thought the Palestinians are done. All the Arabs are embracing Israel. This thing is done and dusted. We can bury the Palestinians and move on to a new era. The big prize, though, it was always understood that the little countries come first, and the big prize, the big wedding, is Saudi Arabia. And so when Netanyahu came back into office at the end of December, at the head of the most openly right-wing and fascist government in Israel's history, he was like, I'm ready to do this deal with Saudi Arabia. But what happened in the meantime? The Saudis were pushing all the normalization. They were totally behind the UAE and Bahrain and everyone signing up with Israel. And they were already playing footsie with Israel. They had opened up their airspace to Israel and so on. And it was just a matter of, crossing the T's and dotting the I's. But a big shift happened. The Saudis figured out that the United States, who they have relied on to guarantee their security explicitly since 1945, basically it was the deal was oil for security. You give us the oil, we guarantee your security. That was really not a very good proposition for Saudi Arabia anymore, because look at the US record in the region. Look at the mess the United States has, they invaded Iraq. The goal was to guarantee American power for another century. Remember, the invasion of Iraq was something pushed by something called the Project for a New American Century. This was supposed to consolidate US unipolar global power forever, to demonstrate to any country, you disobey us, we can send an army to invade you and occupy you and overthrow your government. Same story in Libya. Same story was attempted in Syria with the Obama administration arming these jihadist groups. And as Lowkey mentioned, the sectarian policy, the effort to drive the idea that the region is impossibly split between Sunni and Shia Muslims, which was always a fabrication, this sectarian incitement. Anyway, the Saudis look at this, and then they look at the chaotic US withdrawal in Afghanistan, from Afghanistan in August of 2021. And they look at that and they must be thinking, well, these people, first of all, Washington is 7,000 miles away. If the proverbial SH hits the fan for us, who's going to come and rescue us? Who's going to come and save us? We cannot count on the Americans. Now, where does Israel fit into this? What is the logic of normalizing with Israel if you are a US-dependent vassal state like Saudi Arabia? The logic is, if you normalize with Israel, that gains you more favor in Washington. It makes the Americans more willing to protect you and embrace you. You recruit the Israel lobby to lobby for you as well. And we've seen that AIPAC, for example, the main Israel lobby group, has been doing a lot of lobbying on behalf of Saudi Arabia in the past couple of years. But if you decide that actually the Americans are not our best bet, then the logic of normalizing with Israel disappears, or at least it is greatly diminished. And that is the calculation the Saudis have made. And what are they doing instead? They are embracing their relationship with China, even with Russia, and they're looking at the map and they're saying, we sit next door to Iran. Iran is not going away. We are on the same Eurasian continent as Russia, as China. This is where our future is. And so it's very logical from the Saudi perspective. And of course, Israel is very unhappy and Washington is very unhappy. They've been desperately trying to seal this deal and it hasn't happened. So that's the global shift that is happening. We are now in a multipolar world. Washington doesn't give the orders anymore. even a country like Saudi Arabia, which was always an American vassal, can now say no, because to put this in terms that capitalists can understand, there's now competition. There's now competition. The U.S. is not the monopoly anymore, and Saudi Arabia can build not just relationships with other countries, but potentially much more beneficial relationships, because what does the U.S. bring to the table? You know, it brings military might, it brings destructive power, it's destroyed country after country, but the U.S. is not investing trillions of dollars, as China is, in building up infrastructure that actually benefits people. We're talking about all over the world, roads, railroads. In Iraq, which was destroyed by the United States, the Chinese are rebuilding not just, you know, infrastructure and power stations, they're building literally thousands of schools in Iraq. And that's the story across the world and the continent. So you look at that. When Kamala Harris goes to Africa to do like a propaganda tour for the US government, what does she bring other than slogans and other than, you know, threats and bullying? She doesn't bring
really bad slogans too.
Yeah.
Not inspiring slogans.
Exactly. So this is the world we live in now, and we can see the impact in very quickly changing the political dynamics in the region and in Palestine and the region around it as well.
Jump in, Lowkey. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the interesting thing when you look at Iraq is, you know, the United States, they dropped 30,000 bombs within the first month alone and killed over 1 million people. But across that whole entire period, they've only supposedly built 19 schools. Yet China have signed a deal with Iraq to build going forward 8,000 schools, 1,000 schools in the short term, but 8,000 in the long term. Of course, people in the region would look at China's activity in Africa and say 30% of the infrastructure projects that are happening in Africa are carried out by China. There's 3,500 Chinese companies active in Africa, and 85% of the employees are local people. They look at the Chinese record of emancipating 850 million people from poverty and look at the United States as currently having a life expectancy lower than Cuba, which it has been at economic war with for many, many decades. And they say, well, which would we prefer to pick? I think also there's another aspect of Israel's isolation, which is quite interesting to pick up on. Now, when we look at the revelations around Pegasus and the recent no-click hacking software that Israel has, the Cure Dream one that was recently revealed, both of these projects of revealing these software were carried out by organizations funded by the US government. Now, this is an interesting change. When we look at, for instance, the Saudis using the Pegasus software to hack the phone of Jamal Khashoggi before killing him, this is a way in which many states are outsourcing their eavesdropping and surveillance of dissidents essentially to an arm of the Israeli state. And so when we examine why the United States would be funding organizations that not once, but at least twice or around 3 times have revealed very expansive Israeli intelligence operations, would also cause us to question if there is some sort of trouble in paradise. And even when we look at the recent unrest in the squatter colony of Israel on Palestine, we can see that, of course, you know, we know the Supreme Court is responsible for legitimizing the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, the torture of Palestinians, the imprisoning of Palestinians. And so we understand that the uprising in its defense is not an uprising necessarily for the greater good. But moreover, when we look at some of the key organizations behind these demonstrations, for example, Movement for Quality Government in Israel, this is an organization that for the last 3 years has been funded by the US State Department. And so even, you know, the petulant brat king or the petulant brat prince, Yair Netanyahu took to Twitter and started blaming the US State Department and Biden for what was happening on the streets of occupied Palestine, we have to remember that a wrong clock can be right every now and again. And even you had Ben Gvir come out and say, we are not a star on the US flag. We are an independent country. So all of these things are symptomatic of sharpening contradictions that exist within this project. And it will be fascinating to see what direction it goes from now. Of course, we know that with the Zionist movement, the so-called labor side of the Zionist movement, led by Ben Gurion, essentially with Haganah and Palmach, they provided the backbone of what would become the Israeli military and the Israeli state. So the Jabotinskyite side, which is represented by Netanyahu, is not the dominant trend within the Israeli intelligence and military establishment. So, of course, the US documents which were leaked actually showed that the US surveilling the communications of Mossad leaders found that actually Mossad was actively encouraging, not just giving permission to intelligence employees to take part in the demonstrations, but actively encouraging demonstrations against the Israeli alleged government. And so this is quite an interesting contradiction which is developing here, and all of it contributes to making that power more and more precarious. Of course, added to the fact that you had, during the Unity Intifada in May 2021, Palestinian construction workers within the political unit of Israel went on strike for 1 day. 65,000 Palestinian construction workers went on strike for 1 day. And that cost the Israeli economy $40 million. And according to the vice president of the Israeli Builders Association, he said clearly, we can't build without them. In addition to that, you had Palestinian transport workers going on strike for a day, leading to the cancelling of 300 journeys. So when you take that into account, that Israel's military is a reserve military, meaning they have to take people out of the traditional economy for these assertions of power, there's so many pressure points within this picture, which are just becoming more and more fragile, I would say.